All right, so in the next three videos, I want to take a look at a few specific plays in the early modern theater, and I want to structure this by um, moving along the main dramatic genres that existed at the time, both in terms of popularity and their literary worth. And these genres are, first of all, the histories, and then the more well-known genres of the tragedies and the comedies. This structuring is something that we can find already back in the period. If we look here again at the title page of the first folio from 1623, we can see that the plays of Shakespeare's are divided exactly along these lines: comedies, histories, and tragedies, although we need to, of course, here also be aware that this isn't a differentiation that Shakespeare himself made. This collected edition was, of course, published only after his death. And indeed, it's sometimes difficult to see very clear-cut differentiations between these genres, or rather we see phenomena where one genre borders or crosses into the other or takes elements from another. So the histories, for example, have a tendency to turn into tragedy. We will see that in the development, for example, of Shakespeare's writings, where the later histories have that tendency to focus more on the individual character and thereby give the whole drama more of a tragic feel. Then comedy, of course, can be infused with tragic elements. Again, this is something that we will find in quite a number of Shakespeare's plays, The Merchant of Venice being the most well-known example of something that is traditionally conceived of as a comedy, but then it has so many problematic aspects to it, almost tragic elements to it, that we have a hard time to see it as a pure comedy. So we actually call these problem plays, partly because of the problem of categorizing them according to the genres. And finally, the histories also, of course, can contain a lot of comic elements. There are clownish characters, either minor characters, but also sort of mid characters like Falstaff in Henry IV, who clearly has sort of a comic relief function. So it's not always clear cut, but yet I would say it helps us tremendously to think along these lines of generic boundaries and ask what is specific about the genres, and that helps us to identify also things where individual plays then go beyond these original formula. So the first one that's the genre we want to focus on in this video is the histories, sometimes also called history plays, or even chronicle plays, and we'll see why that is. So what are these? How could we characterize them? First of all, obviously it is a play with a theme from history, but the thing to note here is that it is usually, the idea isn't usually to go as far back into the past as possible, but rather these are usually investigations into the relatively recent past. So it would be more like a World War II movie, or maybe even a Vietnam War movie, than something that goes back into the Middle Ages. So as we will see, many of the history plays were focused on the period that had just become history with the starting of the Tudor dynasty. Structurally, they are often relatively loosely connected episodes that are chronologically arranged. So they don't adhere, it's one of the reasons why we don't see them as tragedies, they don't adhere to these classic idea of Aristotelian unities. They often have a very large time frame and provide us with just sort of these episodic things that are connected by the chronology, but where not necessarily one scene leads into the next. And of course, along with the large time scheme goes a relatively large number of persons that act in each individual play, and they often represent all social classes. I already think I alluded to this when I said that the history plays will be sort of the successors to the mystery plays, in that here we have really large casts where everyone, all the way from the king down to the common man, should be represented. We can easily see this when we look at the dramatis personae from a history play by Shakespeare, Henry V. And I'm certainly not going to go into detail of all of these characters, but I just wanted to give you that kind of list to see both the extent, the amount of people that are involved in this play, and also how that is structured, ordered in terms of social hierarchy. Like it starts with King Henry V, and then the brothers of the king come, and then come a lot of noblemen, then come the officers, then the soldiers, and then others. So there's quite a lot of people. So if you want to do stage a play with your small amateur student group, don't do a history play, because you will need a lot of people. One effect of this very large cast is that there is, relatively speaking, less emphasis on individuals and more on social structures, on political structures. Now, obviously, the king is at the center of the action, but I tried to sketch in earlier videos how the king as a person also has this kind of a political function as a kind of symbolic representative of power, and we meet the kings and queens in this function often in these historical plays, and it's very much about how they are embedded in political and in larger social situations, versus, as we will see, the tragedies that are much more about isolating the hero. And another characteristic of the history plays is that they are often arranged into larger sequences, so that several individual history plays that would be staged on one evening could actually form a larger sequence, and that is obviously another thing that connects them to the mystery plays. The Elizabethan dramatists for the history plays, of course, based their plays on the historical records, the chronicles that were written at the time, and the time's really known for this interest in recent history and in these chronicles. So two of the texts that you will encounter very, very frequently when you look into the sources of these plays is Edward Hall's The Union of the Two Noble and Illustrious Families of Lancaster and York from 1542, and particularly Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland. So all of the historical information that is in these plays usually derives from such sources. So I have already alluded to the fact that the history plays in many respects can be seen as secular heirs to the mystery plays. We saw how they are collected into cycles, but also the loose structure of them, that we have rather significant episodes and maybe even tableau-like scenes where the king is sort of arranged with all of his advisors and so on, instead of a smooth and very tightly organized, smooth-flowing and very tightly organized plot, and that this the scope is rather of importance than the unity of the dramatic unity. And that is of course not just incidental, but it serves a purpose, because very similar to the mystery plays, the chronicle plays point to the lessons that can be learned, and in this case, of course, they point to the past as a lesson for the present. So we need to take a look at what happened in the past in order to learn something for the present, and that is because history doesn't just history in the understanding of the early modern age isn't just something that happens haphazardly, but rather according to a plan. So the history plays also describe historical events in terms of what we would now call a larger scale ideology, a providential plan. So they don't just show things going wherever they go, but rather things following a certain trajectory towards a certain goal and a certain providential plan. Obviously, this in the mystery plays, this was God's providential plan for creation. So they chronicle everything from the creation of the earth until the final judgment. But here it is the nation that is sort of the focus point of this providential plan. And particularly when we're looking at early modern plays that looked into the recent past, that looked into the era preceding the Tudor dynasty, what they one of those sort of ideologies that they are set out to create is what is now being called the Tudor myth. And that is really sort of a tradition in English history, historiography, and in literature that presents the period of the 15th century, so the century immediately before our period, and including the Wars of the Roses, particularly in England, as a dark age of anarchy and bloodshed. This is one of the reasons why, when we're looking at Shakespeare's history plays, which chronicle basically the civil wars of the Roses, they're really showing a country that is deteriorating, that is drifting into anarchy and ever increasing amounts of violence and bloodshed. So then, if that is true, if England really sort of was on a downhill slope into absolute chaos and anarchy, then of course the reinstating the instating of the Tudor dynasty marks a new era of prosperity, of peace, of stability, and that was, of course, as we already saw, very important for these Tudor kings to establish. So it served the political purpose of promoting the Tudor period of the 16th century as this golden age of peace, law, order, and prosperity. And one of the focus points of this whole Tudor myth and this legitimization of the Tudor dynasty is, of course, the character of Richard III. Remember that Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor line, is the last English king to win the crown on the battlefield. So basically by deposing another king, by killing another king, and that is Richard III. So it's imperative that Richard really appears as the epitome of everything that was going wrong in England, and that he is this terrible, despicable tyrant. So to show Richard as this deformed hunchback murderer and villain, that was a very central aspect of the Tudor myth. And there are several historians, but also writers of literature that furthered this. Thomas More, who wrote Utopia, also wrote a history of King Richard III. So founding this tradition of looking at Richard as the absolute bad king that needed to be gotten rid of. And Shakespeare continues that tradition. So one of his more well-known history plays is, of course, Richard III, in which Richard is this really, really evil character who, from the outset, doesn't deny that he's evil. It's not circumstances that force him, but it's really he's born that way, and he's going to be evil. He says that in the beginning of the play. This is a quote from the play. And therefore, since I cannot prove a lover, so I'm not made up for that character of the lover. Since I cannot prove a lover to entertain these fair, well-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days. So I'm determined to prove a villain. I'm going to be the bad guy here in this play. And with that, there's even sort of an echo of the vice figure from the morality play, which is also evil incarnate after all. And this is what Richard presents us here. So really someone who we are supposed to hate, and then in the end, if he gets his deserved punishment, we're supposed to cheer on, and yes, now everything can get better from this point onwards. So when we look at Shakespeare's history in their entirety, we can see both how they fit into a chronology, also how many there are, and how the important point that Richard takes here. So these are all of them arranged in historical chronological order. So as they happen throughout history, you can see all of these different kings. This is basically the history of the Civil War in England, with all of these kings following each other. And you can see here that Richard is here at the end, and then there's sort of an afterthought of Henry VIII as well. But this Richard play is, of course, the culmination of this development. Interestingly enough, this isn't the order in which Shakespeare wrote them. This is the order in which he wrote them. So even the three parts of Henry VI, for example, weren't written in order or in chronological order. So one thing we can do looking at this order of composition is, of course, to see how Shakespeare's art of writing plays develops, and we can see that particularly late plays in this development, like Henry V, have that tendency that I described earlier to move towards tragedy and to be more sort of more tightly controlled and more tragic in their structure and in their character. To sum up, the political drama of the years 1580 to 1640 is essentially a drama of a difficult world, a difficult society, a changing society, troubled, divided amongst factions, amongst ideologies, and this is reflected in the fact that these plays really pose a lot of questions that they cannot answer, that were in the political framework of the time unanswerable, really. Questions like, is there a legitimate way to dispose of a king? How can you get rid of a king? That kings are absolute, so there shouldn't really be a way to get rid of a king, but there is. Now, or what role does qualification play for a king? And what role hereditary rights? So is someone just a king because their father was king, or is there more to it? Do you need to earn that title? Do you need to have some kind of qualifications that legitimize being a king? And also, what is the relation between the king and his people? So what is the function of social structures, of divisions of power, and so on? So these were all difficult questions at any time. They actually became much more problematic as Queen Elizabeth becomes older and older without an heir. So that brings up the question of the succession of the monarchy. How is it going to go on? So it becomes even more inconvenient to look at the more recent past, to look into political situations that are very close to the situation in England at the time. So one thing we can see is that the later history plays then actually tend to recede farther into the past, so that playwrights start to focus on classical history, which was politically less dangerous, and you could make even more problematic topics possible. Just think of Julius Caesar, which is, after all, a play about more or less a people rebelling against the king and deciding that he's become a tyrant and we need to kill him and we need to assassinate him. So very, very difficult question when the queen sits in the audience and looks at that. Oh, so this is what you think of how to treat a king that you don't like. But at least, I mean, that was established history that was so far back that you could do these things and sort of get away with. All right, so that was the overview over the histories, and we'll continue in the next video with a little bit about tragedy.